Eric's journey into the depths of the forgotten forest began at twilight, when the last rays of sunlight bled crimson across the treetops. The air grew colder with each step, the chirping of crickets fading into a suffocating silence. As he ventured further, the dense canopy seemed to close in above him, shrouding the forest floor in shadows that twisted unnaturally. Suddenly, his foot sank into something soft and damp. Looking down, he realized it wasn't just soil. It was black, viscous, and clung to his boot like tar. The smell of decay filled his nostrils, sharp and nauseating, as if something had been rotting here for decades. Then he saw it. At first, it seemed like an enormous tree root sprawled across the ground, its surface gnarled and cracked. But as Eric moved closer, unease crept up his spine. The root wasn't merely sitting on the earth, it was embedded in it, stretching unnaturally far, vanishing into the shadows. The sheer size of it was overwhelming, almost as if it had a will of its own, carving paths through the forest like veins beneath skin. As he knelt to inspect it, he noticed the faintest movement, an almost imperceptible quiver, like the pulse of something alive. The temperature dropped sharply. Eric's breath clouded in the air as an oppressive weight settled on his chest. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath. The silence wasn't natural, it was watchful. He reached out hesitantly, his fingertips brushing the rough texture of the root. The instant he touched it, a faint vibration shot up his arm, and a whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible, tickled his ears. Leave. The word was drawn out, more felt than heard, as if the air itself had spoken. Startled, Eric stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. His rational mind tried to explain it away, wind in the trees, an overactive imagination, but the forest offered no such reassurances. The whisper returned, louder this time, weaving through the stillness, leave now. Panic clawed at him as he turned to look behind him, but the path he had come from was gone. The forest had shifted, the trees forming a wall of gnarled trunks and tangled branches that seemed to leer at him, mocking his helplessness. Desperate to ground himself, Eric pulled out his flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, but it offered little comfort. The light danced across the surface of the root, revealing something horrifying. It wasn't just a root. Faces seemed to emerge from its twisted form, distorted, anguished faces, their mouths frozen mid-scream. Eric's hand trembled as he shone the light further down the root's length. The faces multiplied, each one more grotesque than the last, their hollow eyes seeming to follow him. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, a cacophony of voices that surged and receded like the tide. Don't stay. It's hungry. Eric's mind raced as he backed away, but his foot caught on something, sending him sprawling to the ground. Turning, he saw what had tripped him. A boot, half buried in the dirt. No, not just a boot, a leg, skeletal, and tangled in the root's grip, as if it had been absorbed by the monstrous thing. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. This was no ordinary forest, and this root was no part of nature. Fear turned to dread as Eric noticed something else. The root wasn't just lying there, it was growing, inching towards him with each passing moment. Its cracks widened, revealing a sickly green glow pulsing from within, like veins pumping poison through its grotesque body. The whispers crescendoed into a roar, screaming incomprehensible warnings and pleas. Eric scrambled to his feet, but his legs felt heavy, as if the forest itself was holding him back. The root quivered violently, and for a brief moment, Eric swore he saw something move beneath its surface, a dark, slithering shape that exuded malevolence. He knew he had to leave, but the forest had other plans. Paths that once seemed clear were now gone, replaced by a maze of shadows and tangled undergrowth. Eric's flashlight flickered, its beam struggling against the growing darkness. The root surged forward, faster now, its glow intensifying. It wasn't just alive, it was hunting. Stumbling through the oppressive darkness of the forest, Eric tried to calm his racing heart, but the silence seemed to amplify his fear. Every step felt like an eternity as his boots crunched on brittle twigs and dead leaves. The faint green glow from the root flickered in the distance, as though it were watching, waiting. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking in circles. The trees whispered in the windless air, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Suddenly, Eric's foot hit something solid. Looking down, he saw a small object partially buried in the dirt. Kneeling cautiously, he brushed away the soil to reveal a wooden pendant shaped like a tree, intricately carved with delicate lines. A chill ran down his spine as recognition dawned. This was the same pendant his brother, Marcus, used to wear. Marcus had disappeared years ago during an innocent hike through these very woods. The pendant's cord was frayed, stained with what looked like dried blood. Memories Eric had long buried came flooding back. The frantic search parties, the hollow condolences, the unanswered questions that haunted his family for years. Holding the pendant in his trembling hands, Eric felt an overwhelming sense of loss and guilt. He had always blamed himself for Marcus's disappearance. After all, he had been the one to suggest they split up to explore different trails. But seeing the pendant here, of all places, made the tragedy feel alive again, as though the forest itself was mocking his failure. As Eric rose to his feet, something shifted in the air. The faint, almost imperceptible sound of a child's laughter echoed through the trees, distant but distinct. It was high-pitched, haunting, and all too familiar. Eric froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Marcus," he whispered, his voice trembling. The laughter came again, closer this time, and Eric's flashlight flickered. He turned the beam toward the source of the sound, but the light revealed only the unyielding darkness. Determined to follow the sound, Eric pressed forward, his grip tightening on the pendant. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming a labyrinth around him. The laughter became fragmented, interspersed with muffled whispers that sent chills coursing through his body. "Why didn't you come back for me?" one voice murmured, raspy and bitter. "You left me behind," accused another. Eric clutched his head, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, overlapping in a maddening chorus of blame and despair. The forest floor began to shift beneath his feet, the dirt feeling unnervingly soft, as though he were walking on flesh. His flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something carved into the bark of a nearby tree. A crude figure of two stick-like people holding hands, with the word "forever" etched beneath it. Eric's chest tightened. He and Marcus had carved this when they were children during a camping trip. The tree was now blackened and scarred, its bark oozing a dark, sap-like substance that smelled of rot. Then he saw it, a faint trail of glowing footprints leading deeper into the forest. They were small, like those of a child, and shimmered with the same eerie green light as the root. Against all logic, Eric followed the trail, each step pulling him further into the abyss of the forest. The whispers quieted, replaced by a low hum that seemed to vibrate in his chest. The footprints led to a clearing, where a massive segment of the root coiled like a grotesque throne. Embedded within it were more items, watches, necklaces, shoes, all partially absorbed by the pulsating wood. At the center of the root was a figure, shadowy and indistinct. It seemed to shift in and out of focus, its form flickering like a dying flame. Eric's blood ran cold as the figure turned toward him. Though its face was shrouded in darkness, he could see the faint outline of Marcus's features, his sharp jawline, his familiar grin, but distorted wrong. The figure raised a hand, and Eric's flashlight died completely, plunging him into suffocating blackness. "Eric," the voice was unmistakably Marcus's, but it was warped, layered with something ancient and malevolent. Eric's knees buckled as a wave of nausea overcame him. The pendant in his hand grew hot, burning his palm, and he dropped it with a cry. The figure stepped closer, its shape stretching unnaturally, filling the clearing with its towering presence. Eric felt an overwhelming urge to run, but his legs refused to obey. "Why did you leave me?" the voice demanded, now guttural and furious. Eric stammered, his mind racing for answers. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees swaying without wind, their branches reaching toward him like claws. The root throbbed with an unnatural rhythm, as though feeding off his fear. And in that moment, Eric realized the horrifying truth. The forest had claimed Marcus, and now it was reaching for him. Eric's body trembled as the figure resembling Marcus loomed closer, its distorted form flickering like a dying flame. The clearing seemed alive, the root pulsating in time with the low, guttural hum that filled the air. He tried to speak, to call out to his brother, but his voice caught in his throat, suffocated by an overwhelming sense of dread. The pendant lay smoldering on the ground where he had dropped it, glowing faintly with the same sickly green light as the root. Eric's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but the forest had become a prison of shadows and unearthly sounds. "Why did you leave me?" the voice thundered again, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. The figure of Marcus split into fragments, its shape flickering and reforming, each iteration more grotesque than the last. One moment, it resembled his brother as he had been in life. The next, it became a mangled, hollowed-out husk, its mouth frozen in a silent scream. Eric stumbled backward, his mind racing as fear threatened to unravel his sanity. The root began to shift, snaking through the clearing toward him. Its tendrils coiled and uncoiled like predators stalking their prey, leaving deep scars in the earth. Then, without warning, they stopped, hovering mere inches from Eric's trembling legs. A single tendril reached forward, brushing against his temple. In an instant, Eric's mind was flooded with images. Memories of Marcus laughing, their childhood adventures, the day they carved their names into the tree. But these memories were tainted, twisted with dark undertones, as if something malevolent had rewritten them. Suddenly, the whispers returned, overlapping in a cacophony that Eric couldn't escape. A voice rose above the others, clear and commanding. "Choose." Eric froze, his breath hitching. "Choose what?" he managed to croak, his voice barely audible. The whispers faded, replaced by a single, overwhelming presence in his mind. It spoke with a tone both seductive and terrifying, offering him two impossible options. The first choice appeared vividly in his mind. He could surrender his most cherished memories, those of Marcus, their shared childhood, and the joy they had once brought him. The root promised to release him if he gave up this part of himself. But as the vision unfolded, Eric saw the cost. His memories would feed the forest, strengthening its grip on this cursed land. Without those memories, he feared he would lose the very essence of who he was. The second choice was even darker. Eric could keep his memories intact, but offer something more tangible, his life. The root promised to spare others, to remain dormant, if he sacrificed himself. Yet Eric knew better than to trust such a thing. The root was ancient, cunning, and insatiable. Even if he gave in, it would not stop. It would simply wait for the next victim to stumble into its trap. The tendrils coiled tighter, their tips emitting faint whispers of hunger and malice. Eric felt tears streaming down his face as he grappled with the decision. The forest seemed to sense his hesitation, amplifying the terror. The ground beneath him split open, revealing the skeletal remains of others who had faced the same choice. Their hollow eye sockets seemed to stare at him, their silent screams etched into their decayed faces. Eric's stomach churned as he realized that no matter his decision, he would not leave this place unchanged. The figure of Marcus stepped closer, its face now a grotesque mask of agony and anger. "You left me," it hissed, its voice laced with venom. Eric shook his head, his heart breaking under the weight of guilt. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know," he cried, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The figure raised an arm, and Eric felt an invisible force constrict his chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe. The voice in his mind spoke again, its words like poison, memories or life. "Choose, Eric." The root surged forward, wrapping around his legs and pulling him to the ground. Its surface felt alive, pulsating with a grotesque rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. Eric screamed, his voice raw and desperate, as he tried to free himself. The forest seemed to mock his struggle, the whispers rising into cruel laughter. In a moment of clarity, Eric's mind flashed back to a lesson his grandmother had taught him. Sometimes, the only way to defeat darkness is to give it something it cannot consume. Eric didn't fully understand the meaning, but he clung to it like a lifeline. Gritting his teeth, he made a desperate gamble. "Take my guilt," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Take my regret, my blame. But you won't have my memories or my life." For a moment, the forest stilled. The root hesitated, its glow dimming slightly. Then, with a deafening roar, it surged around him, enveloping Eric in a cocoon of darkness. Pain erupted through his body as the root tore into his mind, sifting through his emotions. He felt the guilt being ripped away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. The figure of Marcus let out a shriek, its form unraveling into shadows that dissolved into the air. When the root finally released him, Eric collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The forest was silent once more, but the air was heavy with an ominous energy. Eric knew he had won, at least for now. But as he rose unsteadily to his feet, the faint whisper returned, colder and more distant. "You chose wisely. But this is not over." Eric stumbled through the clearing, his breath ragged and his body trembling from the ordeal. The whispers had faded momentarily, leaving only an eerie silence that felt heavier than the cacophony of voices that had filled his head. But the forest around him was far from still. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, twisting and writhing like living things. Each step he took seemed to echo, as if the forest itself was mocking his attempts to escape. The root remained partially buried in the soil, but its tendrils now seemed to grow longer, slithering like snakes just beneath the surface. Eric could feel it following him, its presence heavy and oppressive. The pendant he had dropped earlier now dangled from a branch above him, swaying despite the still air. Eric hesitated, his instincts screaming for him to leave it behind. But something compelled him to take it, as if the forest was daring him to touch it again. When his fingers closed around the wooden carving, the whispers returned. This time, they were faint but unmistakable. The voices layered over one another, some pleading, others taunting. "You think it's over?" one hissed, sharp and cutting. "You only fed the hunger," another murmured, its tone almost sorrowful. Eric froze, his hand gripping the pendant tightly as his flashlight flickered. The beam caught a shape in the distance, something humanoid, but impossibly tall and thin, its limbs contorted at unnatural angles. "Who's there?" Eric called out, his voice cracking as fear tightened his throat. The figure didn't move, but its shadow stretched toward him, creeping along the forest floor with a deliberate slowness. Eric backed away, but his foot sank into the soft earth. The ground beneath him quivered, and he realized with horror that he was standing on the root. It pulsed violently, sending vibrations up his legs, and the shadows around him grew darker, almost liquid in their density. The whispers intensified, now circling him like an unseen crowd. They spoke of things he couldn't comprehend, snatches of phrases about sacrifices, eternal hunger, and a debt that could never be repaid. One voice rose above the others, low and guttural, filled with malice. "You cannot run. You belong to us now." Eric turned wildly, shining his flashlight in every direction, but the forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees leaning toward him as if eager to consume him. Then, the shadows began to take form. At first, they were vague shapes, vague impressions of faces and bodies. But as Eric watched, they solidified into grotesque caricatures of humanity. Their features were stretched and exaggerated, their mouths impossibly wide and filled with jagged, broken teeth. They moved jerkily, their limbs twitching as if controlled by invisible strings. One of them reached out, its hand elongated and skeletal, the fingers tipped with claws that glinted in the dim light. Eric bolted, his heart pounding as he plunged deeper into the forest. The whispers chased him, growing louder with each step, until they were a deafening roar in his ears. The shadows followed, sliding along the ground and darting between the trees. Eric's flashlight flickered again, the light barely cutting through the suffocating darkness. He stumbled over a root, crashing to the ground, and the whispers suddenly stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Eric lay still, his breathing shallow, his eyes darting around in the darkness. Then he heard it, a faint rustling, like dry leaves scraping against each other. It came from above. Slowly, he tilted his head back, his heart sinking as he saw the source of the sound. The trees were moving, their branches twisting together to form a grotesque canopy of gnarled wood and shadow. From this writhing mass, a pair of glowing green eyes emerged, staring down at him with an unholy intensity. The whispers returned, but now they were inside his head, bypassing his ears entirely. They spoke in unison, their voices harmonizing into a single chilling message. "You cannot escape what you are. The forest knows. The root knows." Eric scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. The eyes in the canopy followed his every move, unblinking and predatory. The root beneath him began to shift again, coiling and tightening like a snake preparing to strike. As Eric stumbled backward, he felt something cold and sharp brush against his neck. He spun around, but there was nothing there, only the shadows, now darker and denser than ever. His flashlight finally gave out, plunging him into total darkness. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from all directions at once. A sudden pain shot through Eric's leg as a tendril wrapped around his ankle, pulling him to the ground. He clawed at the soil, his nails scraping uselessly against the dirt as the root dragged him closer to its pulsating core. The shadows closed in, their grotesque forms now towering over him, their faces twisted into expressions of rage and hunger. Desperate, Eric fumbled for the pendant, holding it out as if it could protect him. To his shock, the shadows recoiled slightly, their forms flickering and distorting. The whispers returned, but now they were panicked, disjointed. Eric felt a surge of hope, but it was fleeting. The shadows regrouped, their forms solidifying once more. The growl deepened, vibrating through the ground, as the forest prepared to claim him. "You cannot fight us," the voices hissed. "You are already ours." Eric's grip on the pendant tightened as he braced himself for the inevitable. But deep within him, a flicker of defiance remained. He didn't know how, but he was determined to resist, no matter the cost. Eric's hands trembled as he clutched the wooden pendant, its faint warmth the only thing anchoring him to reality. The forest around him seemed to warp and twist, the trees bending impossibly, as if pulled by unseen hands. The shadows that had chased him moments before now lingered at the edges of his vision, their grotesque forms shifting and pulsating with malevolent intent. Each step he took felt heavier, as though the air itself had thickened, pressing down on him with an invisible force. Then, the whispers began again, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in a faint breeze. But these whispers weren't carried by the wind. They came from within, slithering into his mind like serpents. "You'll never leave this place," one voice cooed, almost soothing in its cruelty. "Stay with us," another urged, dripping with false comfort. Eric shook his head violently, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He tried to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, overlapping until they formed a cacophony of fear and doubt. Suddenly, the world around him shifted. The oppressive darkness receded, replaced by an unsettling calm. Eric found himself standing in a sunlit meadow, the air warm and fragrant with the scent of wildflowers. For a fleeting moment, he felt a sense of peace, a reprieve from the nightmare that had enveloped him. But that peace shattered when he saw the figure standing at the edge of the meadow. It was Marcus. He looked exactly as Eric remembered him, alive, smiling, and whole. "You found me," Marcus said, his voice filled with warmth and relief. Eric's heart twisted painfully. This couldn't be real. He knew it couldn't. And yet, the sight of his brother standing there, unscathed and waiting for him, made his resolve falter. Eric took a hesitant step forward, but the pendant in his hand grew cold, as if warning him of the trap. "Marcus?" Eric whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. The figure nodded, extending a hand toward him. "It's me," Marcus replied. "You can bring me back. You just have to stay. Let it take you, and we'll be together again." Eric froze, his mind torn between the undeniable truth and the seductive lie. The whispers returned, this time sweet and coaxing. "You've carried this guilt for so long. Let it end here. Let us give you peace." But as Eric moved closer, the meadow began to shift. The bright sunlight dimmed, and the wildflowers wilted, their vibrant colors draining into ashen gray. Marcus's form flickered, his face distorting for a brief second to reveal something far more sinister. A hollow-eyed husk, its mouth twisted into a predatory grin. Eric stumbled back, the illusion breaking completely. The meadow dissolved, leaving him once again in the suffocating darkness of the forest. The whispers turned cruel. "You could have saved him," they sneered. "But you ran, just like you always do." Eric's chest tightened as his deepest fears and regrets were laid bare before him. The forest began to reflect his mind, shifting and morphing into nightmarish scenes. He saw flashes of Marcus lost in the woods, calling for help, his cries growing weaker until they were swallowed by the void. Eric reached out, but his hands passed through the image, unable to touch or change it. The root reappeared, its glowing tendrils rising from the ground like spectral hands. They didn't lash out this time. Instead, they hovered around him, tantalizingly close. Eric felt an unnatural warmth radiating from them, lulling him into a false sense of security. The whispers softened, becoming almost tender. "We can make it stop," they promised. "All the pain, the guilt, it doesn't have to hurt anymore." Eric's mind began to fracture under the weight of their words. Memories of his childhood with Marcus played out before him, vivid and painfully beautiful. The times they had laughed, explored, and dreamed together were now twisted by the root's influence, each one ending in terror and loss. Eric saw himself running away as a child, leaving Marcus behind in the dark. He saw his parents' grief-stricken faces, their accusing eyes blaming him for his brother's disappearance. The root fed on his despair, each tendril glowing brighter as it drew closer to him. Then the visions changed. Eric saw a version of himself, older, alone, his face etched with sorrow. He wandered aimlessly through a darkened world, haunted by shadows and whispers. This was his future if he let the fear consume him, if he surrendered to the root's will. But there was another vision, fleeting and fragile. It showed him escaping the forest, carrying the pendant with him, a faint light of hope glowing in his eyes. It wasn't a promise of happiness, but it was a possibility. The root hissed, sensing his resistance. The tendrils lashed out, encircling his wrists and ankles, pulling him to the ground. The whispers grew venomous, screaming in his ears, drowning out his thoughts. Eric closed his eyes, clutching the pendant with all his strength. "This isn't real," he muttered, his voice trembling but firm. "You can't have me." The forest roared in defiance, the ground beneath him splitting open to reveal a chasm of writhing shadows and jagged roots. Eric felt himself being dragged toward it, the air growing colder with every inch. But instead of giving in, he focused on the pendant's faint warmth, using it as an anchor. He thought of Marcus, not as a figure of torment, but as the brother he had loved and lost. That memory, pure and untwisted, gave him the strength to resist. The tendrils faltered, their grip loosening. The whispers became disjointed, panicked. Eric opened his eyes, meeting the glowing green gaze of the root's core. "You don't own me," he said, his voice steady now. With a final surge of determination, he broke free, the pendant's light flaring brightly in his hand. The shadows recoiled, screaming as the forest began to quake. Eric stood, battered but unbroken, as the tendrils retreated into the earth. The forest fell silent once more, but he knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The root had tasted his fear, and it would not stop until it claimed him, or someone else. Eric stood in the suffocating stillness of the forest, his knuckles white as he gripped the wooden pendant. The light it had emitted moments ago had dimmed, leaving only the faintest glow, a fragile reminder of his fleeting victories. The oppressive darkness around him seemed alive, shifting and breathing with unseen intent. He could feel the weight of countless eyes watching him, lurking just beyond the shadows. The whispers returned, softer now, like a sinister lullaby meant to lure him deeper into despair. Ahead of him, the root emerged fully from the earth, its monstrous form twisting upward into an archway of pulsating, gnarled wood. The glow from within its core was blindingly green, illuminating the clearing with an unnatural, sickly light. The air vibrated with a low hum, a sound that seemed to burrow into Eric's skull, filling his mind with fragmented images. Faces frozen in terror, hands clawing at the dirt, voices screaming for salvation. He realized these were the echoes of those the root had claimed before him. A voice broke through the chaos, deep and commanding, reverberating within the marrow of his bones. "You are the first to resist, Eric. But resistance is futile. You cannot escape what you have already become." Eric's breath hitched, his pulse hammering in his ears. The root shifted, its tendrils writhing like serpents, and from its glowing core emerged a figure. A humanoid form cloaked in shadow, its eyes burning with the same unholy green light. The figure spoke again, but its voice was layered with others, as if 1,000 souls were trapped within it. "You carry the guilt of your brother's death, the pain of abandonment, the fear of failure. That is what binds you to me. You are mine, Eric. Just like he was." The shadow raised an arm, and Eric felt a sharp, searing pain in his chest. He gasped, falling to his knees as the pendant grew heavier in his hand. The figure began to transform, its features twisting and shifting until Eric recognized it. It was Marcus. But this wasn't the Marcus he remembered. This version of his brother was gaunt and hollow-eyed, his skin stretched tightly over his bones. His lips parted in a grotesque smile, revealing teeth too sharp, too jagged. "You left me," Marcus said, his voice distorted and filled with venom. "You left me to this." "No," Eric shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." But Marcus stepped closer, his movements jerky and unnatural, as though his body were being controlled by invisible strings. "You could have saved me," Marcus hissed, his voice rising to a shriek. "And now you'll join me." The tendrils of the root shot forward, wrapping around Eric's wrists and ankles, pulling him toward the glowing core. The air grew colder, each breath a struggle as the forest closed in. Eric's mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and regret. He could feel the root probing at his consciousness, searching for a way in. It wanted to consume him, to strip away everything that made him who he was. But then, amidst the chaos, a memory surfaced, one untouched by the root's corruption. It was a simple moment, Eric and Marcus sitting by a campfire as children, laughing as they roasted marshmallows. It was pure, untainted by guilt or fear, a fragment of light in the suffocating darkness. Eric clung to it, using it as a shield against the root's invasion. The pendant in his hand began to glow brighter, its warmth spreading through his body. The tendrils around his limbs recoiled, hissing like snakes as they burned against the light. Eric rose to his feet, his resolve hardening. "You can't have me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that clawed at him. "And you can't have him." The shadowed figure let out an inhuman roar, its form distorting and expanding as the root surged toward Eric. The ground trembled beneath him, cracks splitting the earth as the glowing core pulsed with violent intensity. Eric knew he had only one chance. He raised the pendant high, its light now blinding, and stepped forward into the heart of the root. The world exploded into chaos. Eric was engulfed in a torrent of light and shadow, his senses overwhelmed by the clash of opposing forces. He felt the root fighting to consume him, its tendrils digging into his mind, trying to pull him under. But the light from the pendant grew stronger, pushing back the darkness, burning through the root's core. The whispers turned to screams, the voices pleading for release even as the root howled in rage. Through it all, Eric held onto the memory of Marcus, his real brother, not the twisted illusion created by the root. He focused on that moment by the campfire, their laughter echoing in his mind, a beacon of hope amidst the despair. The light from the pendant reached its peak, and with a final surge, it shattered the root's core, sending a shockwave through the forest. Eric collapsed to the ground as the world fell silent. The tendrils of the root lay still, their glow extinguished. The shadowed figure was gone, its presence erased. The pendant, now cracked and dim, rested in Eric's hand, a reminder of the battle he had fought. He looked around, his breathing shallow, as the forest began to change. The trees straightened, their branches no longer clawing at the sky. The oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by the faint light of dawn filtering through the canopy. But Eric knew the fight wasn't truly over. The root might be dormant, but it wasn't destroyed. Its hunger remained, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble into its grasp. As he stumbled toward the edge of the forest, Eric made a silent vow. He would find a way to end it, to ensure no one else would suffer as he and Marcus had. But for now, he had survived, and that was enough. Eric's body screamed with exhaustion as he staggered to his feet, the broken pendant dangling limply from his fingers. The forest around him remained eerily quiet, the once pulsating root now motionless. Yet, Eric knew this wasn't the end. The silence wasn't victory, it was a warning. The root wasn't defeated, it was regrouping. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next act to unfold. A rumble from deep within the earth broke the stillness, faint at first, but quickly growing into a violent tremor. Eric stumbled, barely keeping his balance as cracks spread through the forest floor, black tar-like ooze bubbling from the fissures. The tendrils of the root began to twitch, slowly at first, then violently writhing as though waking from a deep slumber. The green glow returned, this time brighter, angrier, emanating from the core of the root like a beacon of malice. From the glowing core, the shadowed figure emerged once more, but this time it was no illusion. It towered above Eric, its form grotesque and monstrous. The remnants of human features clung to its face, a twisted amalgamation of those it had consumed, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. The figure's limbs stretched unnaturally, its hands ending in razor-sharp claws that dripped with the same viscous ooze seeping from the ground. Its voice, now a guttural roar layered with countless agonized cries, filled the clearing. "You thought you could escape, Eric? You thought you could defy me?" Eric's grip tightened around the pendant, its faint warmth the only reassurance he had. "You won't take me," he spat, though his voice trembled with fear. The figure laughed, a sound that sent shivers through his spine. "You're already mine. Your fear binds you to me, just as your brothers did." The ground beneath Eric cracked open, and he barely leapt aside as a massive tendril erupted, snapping at him like a serpent. The forest came alive with movement. Shadows danced between the trees, their forms fluid and menacing. Faces materialized within the darkness, their eyes glowing faintly, their expressions contorted in pain. Eric realized these were the souls the root had consumed, now trapped as part of its growing power. They reached for him, their hands skeletal and trembling, their whispers pleading for release even as their presence fueled the root's wrath. The figure raised an arm, and the tendrils surged forward, coiling around Eric's legs and pulling him toward the core. He struggled, clawing at the ground, but the root was too strong. The whispers became deafening, screaming in his ears, "Join us! Join us!" Eric's heart raced as panic threatened to consume him. His mind flashed with memories of Marcus, not as the twisted figure the root had shown him, but as the brother he had loved. That memory, pure and untainted, gave him a sliver of strength. As Eric was dragged closer to the core, he noticed something, a faint light within the pendant, barely visible but steady. Desperate, he clutched it tightly and whispered, "Marcus, if you're still here, help me. Please." The pendant flared suddenly, its light piercing through the darkness. The tendrils recoiled with a screech, releasing Eric as the light intensified. The shadowed figure roared in fury, its form flickering as the light struck it. But the root wasn't done. The ground beneath Eric erupted as more tendrils emerged, their movements frenzied and chaotic. The shadowed figure lunged at him, its claws slicing through the air. Eric rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike, and scrambled to his feet. The pendant's light was growing dimmer, its energy fading, and Eric realized he had to act now or be consumed. The core of the root pulsed violently, its green glow almost blinding. Eric felt its power pulling at him, trying to break his will. He remembered the stories his grandmother had told him about defeating darkness. You cannot fight it with brute strength. You must give it something it cannot devour. Eric didn't fully understand, but he knew he had no other choice. He closed his eyes, clutching the pendant, and focused on the memory of Marcus, their laughter, their bond, the love they had shared. The pendant flared one last time, brighter than before, its light enveloping Eric in a protective glow. The shadowed figure screamed, its form disintegrating as the light struck it. The tendrils writhed and burned, their movements growing erratic as the core of the root began to collapse in on itself. Eric felt the ground shaking violently beneath him, the forest itself trembling as the root's power faltered. With a final deafening roar, the core of the root exploded, sending a shockwave through the clearing. Eric was thrown to the ground, his vision blurring as the light consumed everything around him. When he opened his eyes, the forest was still. The root was gone, its tendrils reduced to ash. The shadows had vanished, leaving only the faint light of dawn filtering through the trees. Eric lay there, exhausted and battered, the broken pendant still clutched in his hand. He knew the battle had cost him more than he could comprehend. The forest was quiet now, but he could feel its lingering presence, a faint echo of the terror he had faced. He had survived, but he knew the root wasn't truly gone. It had been weakened, forced into dormancy, but its hunger remained. As Eric stumbled out of the forest, he glanced back one last time. The clearing was empty, but the air was thick with the weight of unfinished business. The whispers were gone, but their memory lingered in his mind. Eric made a silent vow. He would find a way to destroy the root for good. But for now, he walked away, alive but forever changed, the forest's darkness etched into his soul. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet as Eric emerged from its suffocating darkness, the first rays of dawn casting a pale, cold light through the trees. His body ached with exhaustion, his mind fractured by the horrors he had witnessed. Every step felt heavy, as though the ground itself sought to pull him back into the nightmare. Behind him, the clearing where the monstrous root had been was eerily still, but the air hummed faintly, carrying an intangible weight. Eric knew the forest wasn't finished with him. As he stumbled toward the edge of the woods, Eric noticed something chilling. His shadow seemed wrong. It stretched in a direction opposite to the sunlight, flickering unnaturally, as though it were alive. He stopped, turning sharply, but saw nothing behind him except the tangled maze of trees. Yet, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming, pressing against his chest like an invisible hand. The pendant in his hand, once warm and glowing, was now cracked and cold, its faint light extinguished. A faint whisper brushed past his ear, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. Not over. The voice was fleeting, disembodied, and impossibly close. Eric froze, his breath catching in his throat. He scanned the treeline, his heart pounding in his ears. The forest looked normal, serene even, but Eric knew better. The forest was never truly still. He quickened his pace, resisting the urge to look back, every instinct screaming at him to leave. When he finally broke free of the forest's edge, the relief was fleeting. The open sky above him felt vast and unfamiliar, and the ground beneath his feet seemed too solid after the shifting, pulsing terrain of the woods. He collapsed onto the grass, staring at the horizon, but his mind refused to rest. Flashes of the root's glowing core, the grotesque shadowed figure, and the countless faces of those it had consumed haunted him. He felt their eyes on him even now. As Eric sat catching his breath, he noticed a subtle movement in the corner of his vision. Turning slowly, he saw the faint outline of the root, barely visible beneath the soil at the forest's edge. It was almost imperceptible, a ripple in the earth, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. The root was still there, dormant but alive, watching and waiting. The forest had released him, but only because it had chosen to. Eric felt no triumph, only the suffocating certainty that he had escaped only temporarily. Then came the dreams. That night, when Eric finally succumbed to exhaustion, his sleep was restless, plagued by visions that felt more like memories than nightmares. He stood in the clearing again, surrounded by the pulsating root, but this time it was different. The faces of those it had consumed stared at him, their eyes wide and pleading. They whispered his name in unison, their voices hollow and desperate. "You're one of us now," they said. Eric tried to run, but the forest closed in around him, the shadows twisting and pulling him back. When he awoke, drenched in sweat, Eric found himself clutching the broken pendant. The crack in its surface had grown, and inside it, faint green light pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat. Eric's stomach churned as he realized the pendant wasn't just a relic of his brother. It was a fragment of the root itself. The forest had marked him, tethering him to its endless hunger. He tried to throw the pendant away, but his hand refused to release it, as though it were fused to his palm. Over the following days, Eric's world began to unravel. Shadows lingered longer than they should, stretching and twisting unnaturally. Reflections in windows and mirrors didn't match his movements. Whispers followed him wherever he went, growing louder in the dead of night. Sometimes in the corner of his eye he saw Marcus, standing motionless, watching him with hollow eyes. Each time Eric turned to face him, the figure vanished, leaving only the suffocating silence in its wake. The townspeople began to notice Eric's change. His once confident demeanor had been replaced by paranoia and fear. He spoke little, avoiding questions about the forest, but rumors spread. Some claimed to see faint green light emanating from his home at night. Others whispered that Eric would wander the streets aimlessly, muttering to himself about roots and shadows. The more he tried to distance himself from the forest, the more its presence seemed to invade his life. One evening, desperate for answers, Eric returned to the edge of the woods. The pendant vibrated faintly in his hand, as if guiding him. He stood there, staring into the darkness, feeling the pull of the forest's endless hunger. The whispers grew louder, and for the first time, he understood their words. "We are always here. We are always waiting." The root had become a part of him, and no matter how far he ran, its shadow would follow. Eric turned away, vowing never to step foot in the forest again. But deep down, he knew the truth. The forest wasn't bound by physical space. It was a living entity, its influence stretching far beyond its twisted trees. The root wasn't just feeding on him, it was spreading, growing, infecting the world with its insatiable hunger. The faint green light in the pendant was a warning, a reminder that the battle wasn't over. As Eric walked away, the ground beneath the forest shifted imperceptibly, the faint hum of the root growing stronger. Somewhere deep in the woods, the core pulsed with renewed energy, waiting for the next soul to stumble into its grasp. Eric's survival wasn't an escape, it was an invitation. The forest had let him live, not as a victor, but as a messenger of its endless terror. And as the whispers promised, this is not the end.